There is something humans have always done when they are afraid. They reach for something they can hold. Not a promise, not an idea. Something with weight, something with texture. Something that can be touched in the dark when the harvest is uncertain and the rains have not come and the child is not breathing the way a child should breathe. 3,000 years ago, in a narrow strip of land between the Mediterranean coast and the desert, a people kept reaching. They reached for a storm god who owned the rain. They reached for a goddess who stood beside the door. They reached, in their most desperate moments, for something so extreme that the prophets who witnessed it could never fully recover from what they had seen. Their names were Baal, Asherah, Moloch. We have turned them into symbols of evil, into the vocabulary of horror films and cautionary sermons. That is the easy version of this story, and the easy version misses almost everything. Because these gods made sense. They answered real questions. They offered something entirely reasonable, a contract with the divine. Do the right things, at the right times, in the right order, and the rain will follow. The terms were clear. The expectations were manageable. Israel's God asked for something harder than that. He asked for the whole heart. And that, more than any prophetic sermon, more than any royal reform that tore down altars and burned sacred poles, is what this story is about. The distance between a contract and a covenant, between managing a relationship and actually being in one, and between holding something in your hand that you made and being known by something that made you. The prophets of Israel spent centuries trying to close that distance. They were not always successful. This is what they could not unsee. Chapter 1. The hands that made the gods. There is a moment in the second commandment that most people read too quickly. The prohibition is familiar. No carved images, no likenesses of anything in the heavens above or the earth below. The words are repeated in Exodus 20 and again in Deuteronomy 5, both times with a weight that suggests Israel's authors considered this commandment not an afterthought, but a threshold. Cross it, and everything else begins to shift. But the word the Hebrew uses for that carved image, pesel, carries something specific inside it. It does not point toward mysticism or toward some abstract category of spiritual error. The verb at its root means to cut, to chip, to shape material with a tool. It is a workshop word, a craftsman's word. The pestle is made by someone sitting down with a piece of stone or cedar, picking up an instrument, and beginning to work. That detail matters more than it might seem. When Israel's teachers and prophets wrote about idolatry, they were not condemning an abstraction. They were not writing against some vague spiritual impurity or private theological error. They were writing about something that could be held in the hand, something with weight and texture, something that smelled of fresh-cut wood or of the particular dust that settles when metal is worked. The gods of the ancient world were objects as much as they were presences, and their objects were everywhere. Baal had temples with addresses. Asherah had poles planted in specific soil beside specific altars. Moloch had a valley. These were not figures of the imagination operating at some safe distance from daily life. They were woven into the fabric of how people understood weather, fertility, crisis, and survival. To worship them was not considered strange or transgressive in the broader world of the ancient Near East. It was what sensible people did. This matters for understanding why the prophets of Israel were so persistently, sometimes violently, exercised about the matter. They were not arguing with ghosts. They were arguing with their neighbors, people who prayed to Baal before the first rains of autumn, who kept a small female figurine near the door of a house, who knew what to do in a time of military catastrophe and what gods to call on. The prophets were arguing with practices as habitual and culturally embedded as anything we might call tradition. Israel's God demanded something different. The Hebrew word for what he demanded, kana, is usually translated as jealous. But that translation, while technically defensible, carries connotations of smallness and insecurity that the Hebrew does not intend. Kana is the word for an intensity that has been provoked, a heat that rises when something that belongs in a covenant relationship has been given elsewhere. Some scholars compare it to the emotional register of a betrayed spouse, not the cold jealousy of suspicion, but the red-faced, shattering grief of someone who discovers a love given away. When Israel's prophets describe God's response to idolatry, this is the emotional register they are working in. That register tells us something. It means that for the authors of these texts, the relationship between Israel and God was not conceived primarily as a legal code or a theological system. It was conceived as a bond, a covenant, with all the intimacy and exclusivity that word implies. The problem with Baal and Asherah and Moloch was not simply that they were wrong. The problem was that choosing them was a kind of departure, a leaving, and the texts remember every leaving. Before this story can be told properly, there is another layer to notice. The names of these gods, as they appear in the Hebrew Bible, have been quietly and deliberately distorted. The scribes responsible for the Masoretic vocalization, the system of vowel sounds added to the Hebrew consonantal text in the early medieval period, made choices about how certain names would be pronounced. The consonants of Moloch in Hebrew, mem lamd kaf, are identical to the consonants of the Hebrew word for king, melech. But the vowels given to the name Molech are the vowels from the word bosheth, which means shame. The name as it now appears in most Hebrew manuscripts is not, strictly speaking, the deity's name. It is the deity's name with shame inserted into it. The same happened to Baal. In later biblical manuscripts, personal names that originally contained the element Baal, Eshbaal, Meribbaal, names that belonged to perfectly respectable Israelites in earlier periods, were rewritten with Bosheth in place of the divine name. Eshbaal became Ishbosheth. Meribbaal became Mephibosheth. The transformation is so systematic, it could not have been accidental. It was a decision, a theological act performed on the text itself. The scribes were not content simply to forbid the worship of these gods. They wanted to ensure that even saying the name would carry a small disfigurement, a trace of contempt encoded in the syllables. This is worth holding at the outset. The battle against these gods was not fought only with prophetic speeches and royal reforms. It was also fought in the vowel points of the Hebrew script, which suggests how seriously Israel's teachers took the problem. Not a marginal superstition to be waved away, something that had to be actively and repeatedly countered, even in the act of writing. So who were these gods that required such sustained opposition? The answer is not simple, and the simplicity often offered, that Baal was a demon, that Asherah was a foreign corruption, that Moloch was a monster, misses almost everything interesting about the question. These gods made sense. They answered real questions. They offered, in the framework of ancient understanding, plausible responses to the deepest human anxieties about survival, continuity, and catastrophe. To understand why Israel's prophets cared so deeply, it is necessary to understand what Israel was being offered, and why the offer was tempting. Chapter 2. When Baal owned the land of ancient Israel and Judah is not kind to agriculture. It is a narrow strip of terrain between the Mediterranean coast and the desert, with a central ridge of limestone hills and a few fertile valleys. The rains come in winter, they stop in spring. From late April until October, the land dries. Crops planted in the winter rains must be harvested before the earth hardens and the cisterns empty. The whole rhythm of the agricultural year depends on whether the winter rains come when they should, and whether they bring enough water to sustain the cycle. In a landscape like this, a storm god is not a luxury. He is, by the logic of the ancient world, the hinge on which everything turns. Baal-Hadad. The full name of the deity at the center of this story is known to us now primarily through a remarkable body of text discovered at Ras Shamra on the Syrian coast in the late 1920s. Ras Shamra was the ancient city of Ugarit, a prosperous port city that maintained close cultural and commercial ties with the region that would later become Israel. The Ugaritic texts, written in a cuneiform alphabet on clay tablets, give us a voice for Baal that centuries of prophetic polemic had obscured. In those texts, Baal is young and vital. He is the rider of clouds, the lord of rain and storm, the deity who defeats the chaos sea, personified as the god Yam, in a primordial conflict that establishes order over the unruly waters. He is also vulnerable. He dies in the dry summer, defeated by the god of death, Mot. He descends into the underworld. The earth withers, the fields turn to dust, and then he returns in the autumn when the first storm clouds gather over the Mediterranean and the rains begin again. His return is the rains. His presence is the harvest. For the farming communities of the Levant, this was not mythology in the sense of entertainment or metaphor. It was explanation. It mapped onto the visible world with enough accuracy to be persuasive. The rain stopped because Baal was gone. The rain returned because Baal had come back. Worship was the act by which human beings participated in that cycle, building the altars, pouring the libations, offering the sacrifices that maintained the relationship with the storm god. And, through him, with the possibility of survival, the logic was transactional. Perform the ritual correctly, maintain the relationship with the deity, and the rain will follow. It was, in a sense, a contract. Baal's prophets did not ask for devotion in the way Israel's prophets understood devotion. They asked for correct practice. Do the right things, at the right times, in the right ways, and the contract will hold. Israel's God rejected this, not in the sense of rejecting weather or agriculture, or the need for rain. The Hebrew Bible is full of prayers for rain, full of the language of drought as punishment and rain as blessing. What was rejected was the framework. The covenant God of Israel was not to be bargained with. He was not a party to a transaction in which Israel paid in sacrifice, and he delivered in precipitation. What he asked for was not ritual correctness. What he asked for was the whole heart. The relationship was not a contract, it was a covenant, and covenants cannot be satisfied by simply doing the right thing in the right order. This distinction is easy to state and very hard to live. A transaction has clear terms. You know when you have fulfilled it. A covenant has no such clarity. It requires an ongoing attention, an ongoing fidelity, a willingness to keep choosing the relationship even when it would be easier not to. Baal's worship offered something simpler, something with predictable rules and predictable outcomes. Something that fit the shape of human anxiety about rain and harvest, without demanding a transformation of the heart. It is not difficult to understand why people chose it. The story of Elijah on Mount Carmel, told in the 18th chapter of 1 Kings, is the most sustained confrontation between these two frameworks in the Hebrew Bible. The setting is a drought that has lasted 3 years, a drought Elijah has announced as a consequence of Ahab's Baal worship, and a drought that will only end when the question of authority is settled. The contest is not about abstract theology. It is about rain, It is about which god controls what the land most desperately needs. The prophets of Baal call on their god from morning until noon. They cut themselves in the customary way. They cry out with the urgency of people who believe they are doing the right things and are not being answered. Elijah mocks them with an edge that carries real cruelty. Perhaps Baal is deep in thought, he says. Perhaps he has wandered away. Perhaps he is sleeping. The mockery is not simply personal contempt. It is a theological argument. Elijah is not just saying that Baal's prophets are frauds. He is saying that Baal is structurally unable to answer, because a god defined by ritual contract cannot respond to genuine appeal. He can only be activated, and something that can only be activated is not truly present. Elijah's prayer, when he makes it, is spare and direct. He does not perform. He recalls the covenant. He asks for the restoration of what the drought has broken. And the fire comes. The rain that follows is modest at first. A cloud the size of a man's fist seen from the peak of the mountain. But it is enough. The drought breaks. The sequence is deliberate. The contest was never really about fire. It was about rain. About whether the God who makes claims on the whole heart can also do what Baal was worshipped to do: open the sky. Jezebel stands at the edge of this story and deserves more consideration than she usually receives. She is remembered almost exclusively as a symbol of seduction, of foreign corruption, of a particularly female kind of wickedness that was already ancient when the book of Revelation borrowed her name. But in 1 Kings, she is something more specific than a symbol. She is a Phoenician princess who became queen of Israel's northern kingdom, who maintained a household of Baal's prophets and Asherah's prophets at state expense, who oversaw the construction of a temple to Baal in the capital city, and who moved against the prophets of Israel's God with the organized efficiency of someone exercising state power. Her offense, in the political theology of the Hebrew Bible, was not a personal religious choice. It was the conversion of the state apparatus to the service of a competing religious system. Israel's monarchy was understood to be bound by the same covenant obligations as the people, perhaps more bound, since the king's faithfulness was thought to determine the fate of the nation. A queen who actively dismantled that covenant structure was not simply sinning. She was bringing the whole framework down. When the letter to the church in Thyatira, in the 2nd chapter of Revelation, calls out a woman in the congregation by the name Jezebel, it is not primarily making a statement about a specific individual. It is reaching back to this older memory. The danger is not one person's teaching. The danger is the tolerance of a competing religious system. Within the covenant community, the willingness to let the altar of another god stand, while the altar of the covenant God stands beside it. Baal's presence in Israel's story is finally about this: the temptation to address the real anxieties of life through a system that asks for less of the heart, less of the will, less of the difficult, ongoing work of covenant faithfulness. A contract is simply easier than a covenant, and when the rains are uncertain and the harvest is not guaranteed, easier begins to look like wisdom. Chapter 3. The Goddess by the Hearth Inn, the 8th and 7th centuries before the Common Era. A distinctive, kind of small clay figure was being made in the houses of Judah. Archaeologists have found hundreds of them, concentrated almost entirely in domestic settings: houses, courtyards, storage rooms, places where ordinary families lived ordinary lives. They are small, palm-sized objects, roughly fashioned from clay, with a female form in the upper half and a pillar-like base below. They are almost always found broken, probably because they were in everyday use, in the way that objects in regular use eventually break. They date from a period when Jerusalem's temple was active, when the official religion of the Judahite monarchy was the worship of Israel's God, when the prophets were already preaching against idolatry with considerable passion. And there they are, in house after house, generation after generation. These figurines are sometimes called Judean pillar figurines in the archaeological literature. And the scholarly discussion about exactly what they represent has been going on for decades without resolution. They may represent a goddess. They may represent a votive offering to a goddess. They may represent fertility in a more diffuse sense, without reference to a specific deity. What is not in serious dispute is that they represent a dimension of Israelite religious life that the official texts largely deny. They represent a household religion that was being practiced alongside, and perhaps in quiet tension with, whatever was happening in the temple. The goddess most often associated with this household dimension is Asherah. Her story in the Hebrew Bible is stranger than Baal's, in part because she appears in two different registers simultaneously. She is a deity, the consort of El in the Ugaritic texts, a great matriarchal figure linked with the sea and with fertility, the mother of the gods in the Canaanite pantheon. But in the Hebrew Bible, she is also a thing. A wooden pole or a cultivated tree, a physical object planted near an altar or set up in a high place, something that can be cut down, burned, and destroyed. The Hebrew word Asherah refers sometimes to the deity, sometimes to the object, and sometimes to both at once, in a way that makes translation genuinely difficult. The translators of the early English Bible versions often rendered the word as grove, producing passages in which the Israelites are condemned for worshipping under groves and planting groves near Yahweh's altar. This was partly confusion and partly avoidance. They did not quite know what to do with a word that seemed to be both a goddess and a tree. The physical dimension of Asherah is important because it grounds the worship in something tangible and domestic. The Asherah was not located in a distant temple or in the capital city alone. It was located near the altar, near whichever altar mattered in the local community. The Book of Deuteronomy forbids the planting of any Asherah beside the altar of Israel's God. The very specificity of the prohibition suggests that this was not a hypothetical. It was something that was happening. People were planting the sacred pole beside the altar of the covenant God, not instead of it, but beside it. The two were standing in the same sacred space. This is what the archaeology of the 8th century confirms in another way. In the 1970s, inscriptions were discovered at Kuntilit Adrud, a site in the northeastern Sinai that appears to have been a way station on a desert trade route. The inscriptions are graffiti-level texts, written on large storage jars and on the plaster of wall. They include blessings and curses in the conventional forms of the period, and some of them, the ones that have generated the most scholarly discussion, invoke blessings in the name of Yahweh of Samaria and his Asherah. His Asherah, the phrase is grammatically awkward in Hebrew because Asherah is a proper noun, and proper nouns in Hebrew cannot take possessive suffixes in the normal way. The grammar suggests that the word is being used not as a divine name, but as a reference to a cultic object, something that belongs to or is associated with Yahweh. But even that reading is not entirely comfortable because it implies that Yahweh was understood, at least in some quarters of 8th century Israel, to have an associated sacred object that could be identified as his. The inscriptions do not prove that official Israelite religion incorporated an Asherah figure alongside its god. What they prove is that some people, in some places, in the 8th century BCE, understood the religious landscape in that way. And this was not, apparently, a marginal community. Kuntilit Adrud was a busy way station with connections to multiple cities. The people leaving these inscriptions were travelers and traders, people passing through, people representing a range of communities. Their religious imagination included Yahweh with an Asherah. In the prophetic imagination, the tree is the defining image. Trees carry extraordinary symbolic weight throughout the Hebrew Bible. The tree of life, the oak at Mamre where Abraham met his visitors, the almond branch that Jeremiah sees at the beginning of his call. the vine and the fig tree as symbols of peace and covenant blessing. A tree planted near an altar was not simply decoration, it was an axis of divine presence, a living marker of fertility and continuation. Asherah's tree was the deity made local, made tangible, made domestic. To plant her beside Yahweh's altar was to say that the covenant God was not enough on his own for all the dimensions of life that required divine attention. He could be the God of history and covenant and national identity. But for the intimate necessities, the birth of children, the health of the household, the cycle of planting and harvest, perhaps another presence was needed. Perhaps the tree by the door. The prophets understood this differently. Hosea, writing in the northern kingdom in the 8th century, uses the image of marriage with an intensity that makes the metaphor feel less like a literary device and more like a wound. His own marriage to a woman named Gomer, a marriage that appears to have been marked by her repeated departures and his repeated retrievals, becomes in the book a living enactment of Israel's relationship with its God. Israel has gone after the Baals. Israel has attributed its grain and wine and oil to other sources. Israel has forgotten who provided the rain that produced the harvest that filled the storage rooms. The language of betrayal is intimate and specific in a way that would be impossible if Hosea were simply making a theological argument. Jeremiah, a century later, sees the same pattern. He describes the women of Jerusalem kneading dough to make offerings for the Queen of Heaven, a figure who may be Asherah, or may be related to the Babylonian goddess Ishtar, or may be a local fusion of multiple traditions. The practice is not underground. The women are doing this openly, and when Jeremiah condemns it, the women push back with a directness that is startling in a text written to honor Jeremiah's prophetic authority. They say that when they and their ancestors and their kings made these offerings, things were good, the harvests came. There was enough. It is only since they stopped making the offerings that everything has gone wrong. They are not simply defending a tradition they are attached to. They are making an empirical argument. The goddess helped when she was honored. The famine and the disaster came when the honor stopped. Against that argument, Jeremiah has to insist that they have the causality backwards, that the disaster came precisely because of the offerings, not despite them. But the women's response is the response of people whose experience suggests something different from what the prophet is saying. This is not a story of foreign religion penetrating Israelite life from outside. The women Jeremiah is speaking with are not Canaanites. They are Judahites. The practice is not new. Their ancestors did it. Their mothers and grandmothers maintained this household worship alongside whatever they maintained toward the covenant God of Israel. The boundary between official monotheism and popular household religion had never been as clean as the prophets wanted it to be. Manasseh, king of Judah in the 7th century, represents the most spectacular royal expression of this domestication. During his long reign, a carved image of Asherah was placed inside the temple in Jerusalem, not beside it, inside it. The text of 2 Kings 21 records this, with the tone of something almost too extreme to believe. The sacred space that had been built by Solomon and associated with the covenant tradition had acquired, within its walls, the wooden figure of the household goddess. She was not in a separate shrine across town. She was inside the house of the God who had said, explicitly, that there would be no other gods beside him. This is what made the household religion something more than a private matter. When it reached the temple, it had become a public theological statement, the attempt to manage God, to keep him satisfied while also keeping Asherah satisfied, to maintain the covenant while also maintaining the household tradition, had reached its logical conclusion. The sacred space of the covenant God contained the sacred object of a goddess. Both were being served simultaneously. Josiah's reform, a generation after Manasseh, dismantled all of this with remarkable violence. He removed the Asherah from the temple and burned it. He demolished the high places throughout the land. He desecrated the valley south of Jerusalem that had been used for fire offerings to Moloch. He found the graves of the priests who had burned incense to Baal and dug up their bones and burned them on their own altars, defiling the sacred spaces by associating them with death. He destroyed the buildings near the temple that had housed the men and women who wove garments for the Asherah. The reform was total on its own terms, and it failed if success is measured by what came next. Josiah died in battle at Megiddo. His successors reverted. The prophets of the period, Jeremiah above all, saw the reform as genuine but insufficient. It had changed the temples, it had not changed the hearts. The household religion persisted because it was answering something the official religion had not made space for. The figurines were still in the houses. The private altars were still burning. The tree had been cut down in one place and planted again somewhere else. Chapter 4. The valley called Shame south of Jerusalem. Between the city and the hills of the Judean wilderness, there is a narrow valley. It is called in the Hebrew Bible the Valley of the Son of Hinnom, or sometimes simply the Valley of Hinnom. In Hebrew the name is Gi Hinnom. In the Greek of the New Testament, contracted and transliterated, it becomes Gehenna. By the time Jesus uses the word, it carries the full weight of a long history that his listeners would have known without explanation. It was not a metaphor he invented. It was a place they all knew about, with a specific character accumulated over centuries. The history that gave Gehenna its character is not comfortable. The texts of 2 Kings describe what happened there during the reigns of two Judahite kings, Ahaz, who ruled in the 8th century, and Manasseh, who ruled in the 7th. Both kings are recorded as having caused their sons to pass through fire in a valley associated with a deity or a practice called Moloch. The details are spare, and the translators have argued over them for generations. But the general shape is consistent. Children were given to fire in this valley as an offering to Moloch. Jeremiah speaks of this valley directly and with a grief that breaks through his usual prophetic formality. He stands at the entrance to the potsherd gate, which led to the valley, and he breaks a clay pot as a sign of what will come to Jerusalem. He recounts what has happened there. He says that Israel and Judah have built the high places of Topheth, the burning place, in this valley. They have burned their sons and daughters in the fire. And then he says something unambiguous. He says that this was a thing that Israel's God had not commanded, that it had not come into his mind. This is not the careful hedging of a prophet working with difficult material. It is a flat denial. Whatever the theology of child sacrifice was, whatever rationale was offered for the act, within the religious framework that permitted it, Jeremiah insists that this God never requested it, never desired it, never conceived of it as worship. The practice was entirely human in origin. The children who died in the valley died for nothing that the God of the covenant had asked for. The figure of Moloch carries interpretive complications that honest discussion cannot skip. The name, as it appears in the Hebrew Bible, carries those borrowed vowels from Bosheth, the word for shame, that have already been mentioned. But the consonants of the name, those 3 letters mem-lamed kaf, appear in a very different context in Phoenician and Punic inscriptions from sites like Carthage. There they appear as MLK, but in a way that seems to describe a type of sacrifice rather than the name of a deity. Otto Eisfeld, working in the 1930s, argued that the biblical Moloch was not a god at all, but a category of votive offering, a sacrifice of the highest category, a MLK offering, which in extreme circumstances involved a child. This reading has had significant scholarly support, though it has also been contested. The question is whether Moloch was a god with a name, or a term for a practice, or both at once, a practice associated with a specific deity, whose name happened to be the same as the term for the sacrifice. The uncertainty is real and should not be papered over. The biblical texts are not written by people trying to give Moloch a fair description. They are written by people who were horrified by what happened in the valley and who were doing their theological and linguistic best to condemn it. The archaeological evidence from Carthage is the closest parallel. At the site called the Tophet of Salambo, excavations beginning in the 1920s revealed thousands of small urns containing the cremated remains of children and animals. Inscribed stelae accompanied many of the urns, with dedicatory formulas that included the word MLK in exactly the way Eisfeld had predicted, as a term describing the nature of the offering made to Baal or to Tanit, the chief deities of Carthage. The archaeological reality was not abstract. There were the bones, there were the inscriptions, there was the record of what had been done. The interpretation of this evidence has shifted over time. Some scholars in the 20th century argued that the Tophet was primarily a cemetery for infants who had died of natural causes, with the sacrificial interpretation imposed by hostile outsiders. More recent analysis, including systematic study of the skeletal remains, has moved the scholarly consensus toward accepting that at least some of these children were killed as offerings, particularly in periods of crisis or extreme communal need. The evidence for ritual killing, while not absolute, is substantial. Crisis is the key. The logic of extreme sacrifice in the ancient world was the logic of desperation. When the ordinary offerings had failed, when the contracts with the weather gods and the fertility gods had not delivered, when military defeat or plague or famine had pushed a community beyond what normal religious practice could address. In those moments, the ancient world sometimes reached for the extreme offering, the most irreplaceable thing a family possessed. A child, Ahaz, sacrificed his son in the valley during a period of intense military and political pressure. The Assyrian Empire was pressing from the north. His kingdom was caught between the Assyrians and a coalition of smaller neighbors who wanted him to join their resistance. He was a man facing the possible annihilation of everything he was responsible for, and he reached for what his religious tradition offered as the measure of ultimate commitment. That this was, by Jeremiah's testimony, not what God had asked for or wanted. That the sacrifice achieved nothing in theological terms, did not diminish the desperation that produced it. It is worth pausing here to note something about Genesis 22, the binding of Isaac, that the prophetic texts clarify. Some readers of that chapter have seen in it a tacit legitimization of child sacrifice, a story that assumes the practice is real and divine in origin, even as it ultimately stays Abraham's hand. But the prophetic witness of Jeremiah and others does not leave room for that reading. The consistent prophetic position is not that God once asked for child sacrifice and then stopped. It is that God never asked for it, never desired it, never conceived of it as worship. The binding of Isaac, in this light, is not the near completion of a divine request for child sacrifice. It is the intervention that separates Israel from the surrounding religious world. The moment when the extreme offering is refused, when the ram is provided instead, when the logic of escalating sacrifice is interrupted at the threshold. By the time of the Second Temple period, the valley had become, appropriately, a garbage dump. The fires burned there continuously, as they always do in a place where waste accumulates. The smell of burning, the memory of what had happened there, the continuous smoke, all of it combined to make Gehenna a word that needed no explanation. When a teacher in 1st century Judea used it to describe the consequence of unrepented evil, when Jesus invokes it, he is standing in a city that can see the smoke from the valley on a clear day. He does not have to define it, he only has to name it. Chapter 5. What the prophets could not unsee. The prophets of ancient Israel were not, for the most part, comfortable people. This is obvious enough from their biographies, but it bears saying, because the prophetic literature is sometimes read as a collection of formal theological arguments, positions in a religious debate, well-reasoned cases for monotheism against polytheism. That reading misses the emotional texture of the texts, which are not primarily formal arguments. They are the testimony of people who have seen something they cannot unsee and who cannot stop speaking about it. Hosea married a woman who left him. The book does not explain why she left or what she was looking for. It says that she went after her lovers. It says that she attributed her grain and her wine and her wool and her flax to them, the resources that were, Hosea insists, given by Israel's God. It says that she did not know who had provided everything she had. And when Hosea goes to find her and buy her back from wherever she has ended up, the act is not described as a heroic gesture. It is described as something he had to do, something that arose from the kind of love that cannot simply stop even when its object has departed. The theological argument emerges from this private experience, but it is never fully separable from it. When Hosea writes that God will speak tenderly to Israel and allure her back into the wilderness and speak to her heart, he is writing from the inside of a marriage that has been broken and partially restored, and the language carries that weight. The God he describes is not simply requiring the correction of false belief. He is pursuing something that has left and wants it to come home. This is very different from the kind of God who can be satisfied through correct ritual. A God who speaks tenderly to a wayward nation is a God who has been hurt by the nation's departure, and a God who can be hurt is a God who is genuinely in relationship with his people, not administering a contract, but inhabiting a covenant. Jeremiah is later, and the hurt in his texts has become something closer to exhaustion. He has been preaching for years. He has been arrested, thrown into a cistern, publicly humiliated, and persistently ignored. His Lamentations, the sections of his book where he addresses God directly about his own suffering, are among the most honest documents in the Hebrew Bible. He does not perform serenity. He complains. He accuses God of deceiving him, of making his life unbearable, of using him for a purpose that has brought him nothing but grief. And in the same texts, he keeps preaching. The people he is preaching to are not strangers or theoretical sinners. They are his neighbors, people he grew up with, the community that he loves, and that is systematically destroying itself. Jeremiah is not primarily angry about theological error. He is grieved about what that error will cost the people. He can see, with the clarity of a prophet, where the choices being made will lead. He can see the Babylonian armies gathering. He can see the city that will not survive. And he cannot stop speaking, not because he has no fear, but because silence is not available to him. Ezekiel is stranger and more difficult. He receives his call by a river in Babylon, among the first group of Judeans exiled before the final destruction of Jerusalem. His visions are vast and vertiginous. The four living creatures, the wheels within wheels, the chariot of God, moving with a sound like the voice of the Almighty. But when he turns to address the sins of Jerusalem, his language becomes domestic and graphic in a way that has disturbed readers across the centuries. He describes Israel and Judah as two sisters, Oholah and Oholibah, whose history of unfaithfulness with the surrounding nations, Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, is described in explicit marital and sexual language. The passage in the 16th chapter of Ezekiel, in which Jerusalem's history of idolatry is described as the infidelity of a woman given everything she needed, and who gave it all away to strangers, is not comfortable reading. It was probably not meant to be. Ezekiel is using the most charged language available to him to convey what he understands to be the moral weight of what Jerusalem has done. The covenant was intimate. The departure from it was intimate. The consequences will be intimate. What all three of these prophets have in common, despite their very different personalities and historical situations, is that they understand idolatry not primarily as a doctrinal error, but as a relational betrayal. To worship Baal or Asherah or Moloch was not simply to hold incorrect theological beliefs. It was to give away something that belonged to the covenant relationship. It was to address the anxieties of provision and fertility and crisis through a different system. A system that could not love back, could not be hurt, could not pursue, could not speak tenderly. Isaiah adds another dimension. In the first chapter of his book, he delivers one of the most devastating critiques in the prophetic tradition, and it is not directed at idolatry in the obvious sense. It is directed at worship without justice. Israel brings offerings to the temple. Israel observes the festivals and the new moons and the Sabbaths. Israel multiplies its prayers, and God refuses all of it, not because the ritual is incorrect, but because the hands lifting the offerings are, in the prophet's language, full of blood. The orphan is being wronged. The widow's cause is not being heard. The poor are being cheated. And ritual performed in that context is not worship. It is noise. The connection between idolatry and injustice runs through the prophetic literature as a consistent thread. The two are not separate categories. They share a common logic. The logic of treating the world, whether divine or human, as a collection of resources to be managed for personal benefit. The person who uses the poor for economic advantage, and the person who uses correct ritual to compel divine favor, are doing, in the prophetic imagination, a version of the same thing. They are refusing genuine relationship. They are refusing the encounter with the other, whether that other is God or is the neighbor. That would require them to give something they cannot manage or control. This connection is what gives the prophetic literature its moral seriousness. It is not simply religious sectarianism. It is not simply the defense of one deity over another. It is a sustained argument about the nature of relationship. That genuine relationship, whether with God or with other people, cannot be maintained through management or manipulation or the careful performance of correct behavior. Genuine relationship requires presence. It requires the willingness to be known and to be affected by the knowledge of the other. And that willingness is precisely what idolatry, in its ancient forms and in any other form it takes, refuses. Chapter 6. Reform and its limits. Josiah's reform was, by any historical measure, remarkable. He was a young king. The texts say he began his religious reforms when he was approximately 26 years old, after a copy of the law was discovered in the temple during renovation work. What the scribes who discovered it actually found is a subject of scholarly debate, but it appears to have been something close to the Book of Deuteronomy, or an early form of it, with its insistence on the exclusive worship of Israel's God and its demand that sacrifice be centralized in Jerusalem. Josiah read it, or had it read to him, and responded with what the text describes as genuine grief. He tore his clothes. He sent to the prophetess Huldah to ask what God intended. What followed was the most comprehensive religious reform in the history of the Judahite monarchy. Josiah gathered all the elders of Judah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem and read the law to them. He made a public covenant. He ordered the removal of all the vessels associated with Baal and Asherah and the host of heaven from the temple precincts. He destroyed the houses of the male cult prostitutes who had been attached to the temple. He removed the horses that had been dedicated to the sun and burned the chariots of the sun. He pulled down the high places throughout the land, from the northern boundary of the former kingdom all the way to Beersheba in the south. He desecrated the valley of Hinnom by scattering human bones on the altars there, rendering them permanently impure. The reform was not simply administrative. It was deliberate, systematic, and occasionally violent. Josiah was not rearranging the furniture of Judahite religion. He was dismantling the house and burning the timber, and yet Jeremiah, who was alive and preaching throughout the period of the reform, does not celebrate it. He mentions it obliquely and without the enthusiasm one might expect from a prophet who agrees with its theological premises. The closest thing to a direct reference to Josiah's reform in Jeremiah's book is a passage in the 3rd chapter, where the prophet contrasts the treachery of Judah with the apostasy of the northern kingdom Israel. Judah, he says, has returned to God only in false appearance, not in truth. The reform has changed the official landscape. It has not changed the heart. Huldah the prophetess, when Josiah's officials consult her about the rediscovered law, gives an answer that contains both comfort and warning. The disaster will come. The text has been read, and the verdict is clear, but it will not come during Josiah's lifetime. Josiah will be gathered to his grave in peace, because his heart was tender and he humbled himself. The reform buys time. It does not change the outcome. This tension between the genuine faithfulness of the reform and its ultimate insufficiency is one of the most honest elements of the Hebrew Bible's treatment of religious change. The prophetic literature does not pretend that official reforms are enough. They address what official power can reach. They cannot address what lives below the threshold of official observation. What lives there is not simply residual religious habit. It is something more persistent. The Judean pillar figurines that continued to appear in houses throughout the Reform period represent a dimension of religious life that was answering real human needs. Needs that the official theology, for all its depth and moral seriousness, did not always reach. The need to hold something in your hands when you are afraid for a pregnancy. The need to feel that the domestic world, the house, the children, the food supply, is attended to by a presence that notices the small things. The need to bring a question to something tangible when the abstract covenant seems very far away. The prophets understood this need. They did not always know how to address it. Hosea's image of God speaking tenderly in the wilderness, creating a valley of trouble as a door of hope, is one attempt to locate the covenant God in the intimate spaces of life, as well as in the national narrative. Jeremiah's new covenant, written on the heart rather than on stone tablets, is another. The insistence that the law of God is not something external and formal, but something that can be internalized, that the relationship does not require a stone building or an official priesthood to be real, is perhaps the most direct prophetic attempt to answer the household religion on its own terms. But answering the household religion on its own terms takes a very long time. Longer than any single reform can manage. There is a detail in the account of Josiah's death that functions like a small, quiet tragedy. He dies at Megiddo, fighting the Egyptian pharaoh Necho. The texts do not fully explain why he engaged in this battle or what he thought he was doing there. Necho was not attacking Judah directly. He was passing through on his way to support the Assyrians against the Babylonians, and Josiah apparently placed himself in the way. Some interpreters have seen in this a political miscalculation, a misreading of the military situation. Others have seen in it something more poignant. A king whose faithfulness was genuine and whose reading of the world was nevertheless wrong about what God required of him in that moment. Whatever the explanation, the death at Megiddo ends the reform. The kingdom falls within a generation. The city is burned, the temple is destroyed, the population is carried into exile, and in Babylon, the exiles have to learn to practice their religion without a temple, without a land, without the cultic infrastructure that official reform had tried to purify. That enforced simplicity turns out to be important. The exile strips away every element of Israelite religion that required a specific location, or a specific building, or a specific priestly system. What remains is text and memory, and the practice of prayer, and the reading of the law in assembly. What remains is, in other words, is something that can travel, something that can survive in a foreign city, in a diaspora, in any condition that does not allow access to the sacred geography of the homeland. The official reformers had been trying to consolidate religion in the temple, to centralize it, to make it legible and controllable. The exile dissolved the temple and the legibility with it, and what emerged from that dissolution was a form of religious life far more resilient than anything the reformers had intended. The household religion survived too, of course, but it survived differently. The figurines stopped being made, at least in their characteristic 8th and 7th century form, after the exile. The high places outside Jerusalem remained in many cases permanently desecrated. The exile had done something that the reform could not do. It had made the familiar landscape of local worship inaccessible, and in that inaccessibility, something had changed. Not completely, never completely, but enough. Chapter 7. The altar in the courtyard. The story of Gideon begins in a winepress. He is hiding there, threshing wheat, because the Midianites have made ordinary life in the open impossible. They come with their livestock at harvest time and strip the land. They have been doing this for 7 years. Israel is poor and frightened and has retreated, in the text's phrase, into the dens and caves and strongholds of the mountains. Gideon is threshing in a winepress because it is the only place he can do it without the Midianites seeing the grain. An angel appears and calls him a mighty man of valor. The irony is intentional. He is hiding in a hole in the ground. He is not a warrior. He is not a leader. He is a farmer trying to save his harvest from thieves. When he asks why, if God is with Israel, all of this is happening to them, he does not receive a theological explanation. He receives a commission. Go and deliver Israel from Midian. Go in this strength that you have. He asks, as people in such situations often do, what strength that might be. His clan is the weakest in his tribe. He is the youngest in his family. He does not yet know what he is being asked to do, specifically and first, before anything about Midian. The commission is given at night. He takes 10 of his servants, and he goes to his father's house, and he tears down the altar to Baal that is there, and he cuts down the Asherah beside it. He uses the wood of the Asherah to build a different altar, and on that altar he offers one of his father's bulls as a burnt offering to the God of Israel. He does this at night because he is afraid of his father's household and the men of the city. This detail is not incidental. It is perhaps the most important detail in the entire episode. Gideon does not do this because he has overcome his fear. He does not do this from a position of confident faith in which the outcome seems assured. He does this afraid. He has received a word, a commission, and he acts on it in the dark, quickly, with helpers, hoping not to be caught, because the courage to do it openly in daylight is not available to him yet. When the men of the city discover what has happened in the morning, they want to kill him. His father Joash defends him with a sardonic practicality. If Baal is a god, let Baal contend for himself. Let Baal deal with the man who tore down his altar. From that moment, Gideon is given a new name, Jerubbaal. Let Baal contend. The name is not a title of honor in the conventional sense. It is a kind of permanent question mark. It stands as a record of the challenge. Let the god defend himself. Let us see what happens when his altar is torn down and his champion is not destroyed. The name encodes, in miniature, the same argument Elijah would make on Carmel, that a God who requires human maintenance and cannot defend himself against a farmer with 10 helpers in the dark is a God whose claims require examination. Several things in this story deserve extended attention. The first is the location of the altar. It is not in a temple. It is not in a high place in the hills or in the public square of the city. It is at Gideon's father's house. The Baal worship that has to be dismantled before Gideon can become who he is called to be is not some foreign thing imported from a neighboring nation. It is the worship maintained in the household he grew up in. It is his father's altar. It is the religion of his family. Reform, in this account, does not begin in the capital city. It does not begin with the king or the priests or the official religious institutions. It begins in the courtyard of a frightened farmer's house, in the middle of the night, with 10 helpers and the sound of tools working as quietly as possible. The second thing is the wood. The Asherah does not simply disappear. It is cut down, but the material is repurposed. Gideon builds Yahweh's altar, partly from the timber of the fertility symbol he has just dismantled. The old sacred object does not get to simply vanish. It becomes, literally, the fuel for the new offering. There is something in this that resists the reading of biblical history as a simple replacement of the old with the new. The old material is still there. It has been given a different direction, a different meaning. But it is the same wood. This is also how the New Testament reads the Hebrew Scriptures. Not as text to be discarded once the new covenant has arrived, but as text to be reread, re-understood, inhabited differently. The letter to the Hebrews makes this argument at length, with the sacrificial system of Israel as its primary subject, the system of offerings. Bulls and goats and birds and grain was not wrong in itself. It was reaching towards something it could not fully accomplish, the same human need that drove Baal worship and Asherah worship, and the terrible extremity of the Valley of Hinnom was the need for assurance that the barrier between the human and the holy could be crossed, that something could be given that would bridge the distance, that the covenant could be restored after it had been broken. The letter to the Hebrews insists that this crossing happened once. Ephapax, the Greek word says, once for all, once in a way that does not need to be repeated, in a way that ended the cycle, not ended it by abolishing the desire for crossing. That desire is as old as the pestle, the carved image, as old as the human hands that first picked up a tool and began to shape a piece of cedar into a presence. What ended was the necessity of the repetition, the endless returning to the altar with another animal, the season of Baal's absence and return, the fertility offering renewed each spring, the votive sacrifice in each crisis. Something was placed in the cycle that broke it, not from outside human experience, but from inside it, in a life lived in a specific place, among people with names, in a history that intersected with all the other histories the Hebrew Bible had been keeping track of. Gideon's story does not end tidily. He becomes, eventually, a successful judge and military leader. He defeats Midian. He is offered kingship by the people and refuses it. And then, near the end of his life, he takes a golden earring from each soldier's share of the Midianite plunder and fashions from them an ephod, a priestly garment or sacred object, which he installs in his hometown of Ophrah. And the text says, without extensive commentary, that all Israel warred after it there. And it became a snare to Gideon and to his family. The man who tore down his father's altar to Baal built his own sacred object. The pattern recurred. This is not a moment of simple irony in the text. It is a diagnosis. The problem with idolatry, in the prophetic understanding, was never primarily a problem of correct information or of sufficient moral instruction. Gideon knew what he had done at his father's altar. He remembered the night in the dark, with the 10 helpers and the wood of the Asherah burning under the offering. He had lived through the whole story. And at the end of it, under the influence of success and accumulation, and the ordinary human desire to create a lasting mark, he made a thing that people bent toward. The question the prophets keep returning to is not which objects are permitted. It is a question about the direction of the heart. What is the thing you bring your deepest need to? What is the presence you trust with the most irreplaceable things? The rain, the harvest, the child, the crisis. What have you put your hand on when the covenant God seems distant and the urgent need is immediate? The valley was real. The goddess was in the house. The storm god had addresses and temples and priests who knew which prayers worked. These were not abstract temptations. They were embodied, local, immediate answers to questions that human beings have never been able to stop asking. And the prophets did not answer those questions by saying that the questions were wrong. They did not say that rain does not matter, or that fertility is not a real concern, or that extreme crisis does not produce extreme desperation. They said something harder than that. They said that the framework through which those questions were being addressed, the framework of contract and leverage, of giving the right thing in exchange for the right outcome, of managing the divine relationship through careful maintenance, was built on a misunderstanding of what the relationship was, and that the misunderstanding was not only costly to the people of Israel in their particular historical moment. It was a misunderstanding about the nature of relationship itself. The covenant demanded something that no contract demands. It demanded being known, not just properly behaved, not just ritually correct, known in the full weight of what that word means, with the faithfulness that follows from genuine encounter, rather than the performance that follows from contractual obligation. And being known, in that sense, requires a willingness to be seen that is not comfortable and not manageable and not available to people who are keeping their options open. Gideon went back to his courtyard the night he received his commission, and he did the one thing that was required before he could become anything else. He tore down the altar his family had been maintaining. He was afraid. He did it anyway. That sequence, afraid and acting despite it, in the dark without confidence in the outcome, starting in the intimate space of the household, rather than waiting for a more public moment, is perhaps the most honest portrait of religious faithfulness in the entire narrative. Not the fire on Carmel, not the great public reform of Josiah, not the long lament of Jeremiah's prophetic career. The farmer in the dark, with 10 helpers, tearing down his father's altar in the courtyard, whatever altars are maintained, in whatever dark private courtyards. The gods of provision approached through management rather than trust. The household presences that divide what was meant to be whole, the desperate extreme reached, for when ordinary faithfulness does not seem to be working. The prophetic word on them has not changed. The altar in the courtyard comes down first. Everything else follows from that.